Seneca Canoe Song. Kaiua jine o ho he ho, Kaiua jine, Kaiua jine, Kaiua jine yo ho he, Kaiua jine, Kaiua jine, Kaiua jine yo ho he, Kaiua jine, Kaiua jine. Woo! Kwai kwai ni doba, hello my friends. Diluise soza pala noki da hozid. My name is Joseph, or the Peaceful One, and I SARATOGA alanobison beak. I'm of this area you call SARATOGA, or the Medicine Spring Place. And those words that I spoke were in the Abenaki language, the language of my ancestors on my mother's side of the family. As a writer and a storyteller, I've always been fascinated with the stories of our indigenous people that are often not known by the general public. And there are certain characters I've found myself attracted to again and again over my life as a writer and a storyteller, and one of them is the man known as Ely Parker. Ely Parker was born in 1833 in western New York, among the Haudenosaunee Nation we know in English as the Seneca people. He was actually one of the most educated men of his day, but his entire story is a fascinating one that begins at a time when very few people in his nation could even speak the English language, at a time when, after the Revolutionary War, much of the land of the Seneca people and the Haudenosaunee nations, the 5 nations of the Iroquois, had been taken by white settlers. In fact, if you look at this podium here, you'll see what's called the Hiawatha Belt. This is a wampum belt that was made to commemorate the founding of the Great League of the Haudenosaunee. In the center is a pine tree, and to either side, these 4 shapes stand for each of the 4 nations around the central nation of the Onondaga. They were the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. They still remain to this day, those 5 nations, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. And they say that long ago, warfare happened between all 5 of those nations. It was a time when nothing and no one was safe. And the Creator, Shonkweyadiso, the holder up of the heavens, sent down a messenger known as the Peacemaker, who, through his words and through his actions, brought together those 5 warring nations and formed a great league of peace. And at Onondaga, the center in these nations, at Onondaga, they dug a hole and symbolically planted a weapon of war, and then planted a tree above it. It became the Tree of Peace, and that great Tree of Peace, on top of it was an eagle holding 5 arrows bound together. The old quarters in the United States had that same eagle holding the 13 arrows of the 13 colonies. For indeed, the League of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois became the model for Benjamin Franklin's idea for the Articles of Confederation and also the American Constitution. There was a book, in fact, written by Lewis Henry Morgan. It was the first, we could say, first book of ethnology ever published, and it was called The League of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, published in 1851. This is a reprint of this book, and I'd like to read you the dedication. The dedication reads, Tuhasa no Anda, Ely S. Parker, a Seneca Indian, this work, the materials of which are the fruit of our joint researches, is inscribed in acknowledgement of the obligations and in testimony of the friendship of the author. This book would not have existed without that person I'm talking about today, Ely S. Parker. When Ely Parker was a very young man, it was the decision made on the part of his elders that he should go to school, that he should learn the English language, that he should indeed learn the ways of the European to protect his people. Because what had happened in western New York is that even though the Seneca lands were supposed to be theirs forever, these few small reservations that remained, something called the Ogden Land Company and other interests were attempting to gain that land. In fact, at one point, a document was signed giving the land, which became the city of Buffalo, to the Land Corporation. the Buffalo Reservation. The Buffalo Creek Reservation was lost in that way. It turned out, of course, the document was a forgery. All the names that were signed supposedly by Native people were not really by Native people. But the judges ruled that because it had already been done and white people had already moved onto that land, that it could not any longer be Seneca land. So that was the atmosphere that Ely Parker was coming into. That was why he was being given this opportunity to learn to speak the white man's language and to be able to be a speaker for his people. In fact, throughout Parker's life, he became the main envoy for his people, for the Tonawanda Seneca Reservation. He traveled to Albany. He traveled to Washington, D.C. He met every governor of New York State. He met every president of the United States. In fact, he was invited into the White House on numerous occasions as a guest. This young man who was, even though he was a teenager and then in his early 20s, was carrying that great responsibility. And it was largely through Parker's work and also through the work of the Tonawanda people themselves that their reservation eventually was preserved and remains to this day in their own land. They still live there, although it's only a small part of what was there originally. But what I'm going to do right now, though, is share with you a little bit from my new book, which is called One Real American, and it is the life of Ely S. Parker, and this is the cover drawing, or the cover illustration of One Real American. The book will be out in the fall. And why is it called One Real American? This will explain why. Chapter 1, called A Meeting at Appomattox. This is a quote from Ely Parker's unpublished autobiography, which I've interspersed in each of the chapters. I was present at the meeting of the two generals commanding the great two contending armies, Grant and Lee, the one modest and reticent, the other dignified but broken. I saw the one write his terms for surrender, and the other his acceptance of the same. I hold in my hand an original of General Grant's terms of surrender in his own handwriting, which I, as military secretary, transferred into ink before it was passed to Lee. I should mention, and I'll go back to this a little bit later, that during the American Civil War, he was a brevet general and became the personal secretary to Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, he was regarded as the best writer in terms of penmanship and the best speaker in terms of expressing himself in the entire Union Army. And it was well known before he began to work with Grant that Grant's staff was nearly illiterate, if I could quote what was written at the time. April 9th, 1865. Was a warm spring Sunday in the town of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Accompanied by several members of his staff, General Ulysses S. Grant approached the house of Wilmer McLean, who had offered the use of his parlor for the signing of General Robert E. Lee's terms of surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. It was an event in that modest two-story building that would mark the formal conclusion of hostilities between the North and the South, though there were other battles lasting until the Confederate general, a Cherokee, General Stand Watie, gave up in June of that same year. Very few people know that the last Confederate general to surrender was in fact a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. It would bring to an end the American Civil War. Inside that house, dressed in a new uniform and wearing the ceremonial sword given him by his beloved home state of Virginia, Robert E. Lee, the brilliant Southern commander, waited. That uniform, as Grant himself would later note in his memoirs, completed here at the Grant Cottage, was a contrast to what the leader of the Union forces appeared in. Quote, "In my rough traveling suit, the uniform of a private with the straps of a lieutenant general, I must have contrasted very strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high, and of faultless form. But this was not a matter I thought of until afterwards." Lee's retreat after Petersburg and Richmond fell had been blocked by Grant. The charismatic Southern leader's only choice, one he found hard to make, was to accept defeat. He'd sent a note asking for an interview to discuss the terms of surrender. That note, as Grant's personal secretary. Brevet Brigadier General Ely S. Parker would later recall, was read by Grant with no outward show of emotion. That was no surprise. Grant was famously taciturn. Grant's staff, however, reacted quite differently. As Parker put it, the staff had a little jollification of their own on the lonely road in the woods by cheering, throwing up their hats, and performing other such antics as their tired limbs and dignity would permit. Grant's reply to Lee, written by Parker, who was always by his side, reflected his readiness to meet. It was delivered by one of Grant's aides, General Orville Elias Babcock, who now stood waiting for Grant in front of the house's wide front porch. While he ushered the Union commanding general up the steps and into the parlor, the rest of Grant's staff sat down on the porch, but only for a moment. Babcock soon returned to the door. "The general wants you all to come in," he said. What happened next, the formal introduction by Grant of each of his staff members to General Lee went smoothly at first. As Parker noted, Lee shook hands with each in the most courteous, condescending, and yet affable manner, making no remark further than passing the usual salutation, until Parker himself held out his own hand. According to Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter, another of Grant's secretaries, when Lee saw his swarthy features, he looked at him in evident surprise, and his eyes rested on him for several seconds. What passed in his mind, no one knew, but the natural surmise was that he mistook Parker, who was famously dark-skinned, for a Negro, and was struck with astonishment to find the commander of Union armies had one of that race on his personal staff. But whatever Lee had been thinking, he soon recognized the dark skin of the person before him, though dressed in a Union uniform, marked him not as one of African ancestry, but as a Native American. "I am glad to see one real American here," Lee said as he took Ely Parker's hand. "We are all Americans," Parker replied. That moment was one of the high points in the life of Ely Parker, though there were indeed many others. I should point out that when he first went to school, he found the English language so difficult to speak that when called upon to stand up in church and translate a sermon in English into Seneca, his words went slower and slower and slower, and then he fainted dead away from the stress of trying to speak that confusing English language. He left school and then made a trip to Canada in his teenage years, where he lived with relatives and learned, as he put it, the way of the bow and arrow, how to track the deer, how to fish with a light, do all these things in the wilderness of Canada, so different from the part of New York he had left where the game had gone, where the trees had been cut down, and the Seneca Reservation was surrounded by white farmers. When he returned back from Canada to the United States, an interesting thing happened. He agreed to accompany a group of British officers who saw him as a mere savage. They made jokes about him. They mistreated him. They hardly knew that he could speak their language. And in fact, it lit a fire inside Parker's bosom. From that point on, he decided no white man would ever make fun of him again. He would master the English language, and he would do it better than most white people did, as a matter of fact. He went back to school. He excelled in the little school which was near his reservation, and then he went on to a private school, Cayuga Academy. He went on and became so well versed in the language, and he also studied Greek and Latin. They became the most famous public speaker in the school. People would come from miles around to hear him speak. I should point out that one thing that was important in Ely Parker's life was his ancestry. His mother was supposedly a direct descendant of Jigonsase, the first woman to embrace the idea of the peacemaker, the first woman to be one of the founders of the League of the Haudenosaunee, a legendary character. That also in his ancestry was a famous corn planter, a man well known to the native people and the Europeans of the time, and none other than Handsome Lake, the founder in 1800 of a new religious way that helped to create a rebirth of faith among the Seneca and the other Iroquois people. And also his great uncle, Red Jacket. Red Jacket, Sagoyewata, as he was known, he who keeps them awake, was regarded as the greatest orator among the Haudenosaunee people. He did not speak English. He spoke only the Seneca language. But when he spoke it, even European people would come. Even white people would be in the audience to hear his incredible declamation, his deep rolling voice. It is said that Red Jacket learned how to speak by standing next to Niagara Falls and speaking above its roar. To this day, there is a statue of Red Jacket next to Niagara Falls in that place where they say he stood. Parker was proud of that ancestor. And in fact, a large medal was given to Red Jacket from General Washington, a famous medal, which is actually in the Buffalo History Museum to this day. And there are photographs of it that I included in my book, One Real American. That medal shows a white man and an Indian shaking hands, and they are joined together in friendship. That medal became a very important symbol for Parker. Throughout his life, he would wear that medal on special occasions. It belonged first to his great uncle, who was the holder of the position of Donehogawa, or the keeper of the western door. Let me back up a little bit again to that foundation of the forming of the League of the Haudenosaunee. There were, and there are to this day, 50 different chieftaincy positions, or rodeoners, men of good mind who speak for the women of their clan. Those 50 representatives from the 5 different Haudenosaunee nations each have a name that is the same name as their predecessor. It is as if everybody who became the President of the United States automatically became the Washington. And so it is that such names as Iontwatha or Hiawatha and Donehogawa have been passed on down. So when Ely Parker himself, as a young man in his 20s, after the death of his great uncle, took on that role, his name, which had been Hasa Noanda, mentioned of course in the book League of the Iroquois by Lewis Henry Morgan, Hasa Noanda, which meant either the open book or the reader, his name became Donehogawa, and he set aside that original name of Hasa Noanda, and regarded himself as the principal sachem. In fact, the state of New York regarded him as the most important leader among the Haudenosaunee people. That wasn't exactly accurate, but he was happy to be called a grand sachem and used that title throughout the rest of his life. So there Parker had become, even before he became a general in the Union Army, a brevet general admittedly, he was already a major political force among his people. And he was recognized in this way, I'm sure, in great part because of the work he did to preserve their reservation from the land company. Keeper of the western door. His ambition after that was to become a lawyer. And he began to work with a lawyer. In fact, he had worked with him before they managed to finally stop the sale of their land and maintain it for the future. And he studied with the firm of Angel, it was called, Mr. Angel, who was one of the people who was assigned or given the position of a superintendent to the Iroquois. Unfortunately, although he was basically practicing law, and in those days, most people did not go to college to learn law. They learned on the spot, as did Abraham Lincoln. They did not go to school to become a lawyer, but then they had to take the bar exam. It was ruled that as an Indian, he was not a United States citizen, and therefore he was never able to take the bar exam. It has been said, by the way, inaccurately, that he studied law at Union College. He did not. That is not true, but it occurs in some of his biographies. So now that he could not become a lawyer, what could he do? He came up with another idea. And his friend Lewis Henry Morgan helped him on this way. And I should mention another interesting thing about Ely Parker. Early on, he became a member of the Masons. And the Blue Lodge of the Masons was extremely important to him. It was something that had actually been part of Iroquois tradition for quite a long time. In fact, one of the most famous Iroquois leaders of the Revolutionary War period was a man known as Joseph Brant, who was a Mohawk. Joseph Brant actually became a very high-ranking officer in the British military and joined the British side during the Revolutionary War. Brant himself was a high-ranking Mason. So Ely's involvement in Masonry meant that throughout his life, other Masons would step up and help him. In fact, at one point when he found himself on trial, when he was the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as it was not called yet, his lawyer, Mr. Chipman was a Mason. And throughout his life, again and again, the Masons were important to him. So he was given another job at this point. He could not be a lawyer, but he could work on the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal, which had been built and was constantly being enlarged and being worked upon in those days, in the early 1800s, before the Civil War, 1840s and thereon, needed people. So he began to work as a clearer with an axe, clearing space for the rod, and then he became a rod man. Then he learned to use the transit, and then eventually he became a civil engineer. A very high-ranking civil engineer, and he was hired by the United States government to be a civil engineer. And they sent him to a place in the Midwest called Illinois, named after the Ely people, Illinois, in a town called Galena. And there in Galena, he met another young man. A young man who had served in the military during the Mexican War, served by the side of a man named Robert E. Lee, who also served in that same Mexican War. And then when the army was cut back after that Mexican War, he found himself no longer needed, and so he went to work in his father's dry goods store in Galena, Illinois. He hated that work. His name, as you may have guessed, was Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant and Parker became fast friends. In fact, Parker said, and I paraphrase, that he found Grant much like many of the Indians he knew because he was reticent to speak much in public and would hold his own counsel. And they became very close friends. In fact, at one point, Grant was in an altercation with a number of people who were trying to beat him up, and Parker stepped in. They stood back to back and withstood the onslaught of these ruffians who were trying to rough up Ulysses S. Grant. Like Grant, Parker became a member of a volunteer militia, and he was very good at it. He became an officer in an engineers division of that militia. So when the American Civil War started, Parker tried to enlist. He was certain his engineering skills could be of use to the military. And by the way, he had lost his position as an engineer because of the change of government. As often happens when a new president comes in, new people come in. And because he was affiliated with the party, not the Republican Party, but the other party, he lost his position. So he was basically without work, living at home in a house he had built for his parents on the Tonawanda Reservation. He tried to enlist on several occasions. And he was sold by Seward, who was the Secretary of War, that we do not need you. This is a white man's war. You are not needed, so don't try to enlist. He tried a number of times and failed. And then, as he was working in his farm, a rider came up bearing a letter that he was given a commission to serve in the Civil War as first a colonel and then with the rank of adjutant general. And he quickly was called upon by Grant to become his personal secretary. And as I've indicated, most of Grant's proclamations were written by Parker, not just written out, but corrected and often his own words for the various times that, for example, the great battles that were won and there on Missionary Ridge. Who was it who writes down the words but Parker? And he, as a member of Grant's staff, was a very significant person. Ely Parker was not the only Indian or the only Seneca to serve in the Civil War. Ironically, his younger brother, Newton Parker, had successfully enlisted in 1862 and had actually served in a company made up of other Iroquois people, mostly Tuscaroras. And of course, in the South, as I mentioned, the person who was one of the most important Union generals in the Western Theater was himself a Cherokee Indian. And the story of how the Cherokee Nation became divided between those loyal to the Union and those loyal to the Confederacy is very complex. And in fact, because the Cherokees had been so poorly used by the United States, had been sent on the Trail of Tears, many Cherokee people felt that the new Confederate states would treat them better than had the Union. And so it was not surprising that that decision was made. This is a couple of descriptions of Grant and Parker from the Civil War. Parker would frequently bear witness to the sort of man Grant showed himself to be. This is a quote from Parker. Grant never cared much about how he looked, but he did take care of his hat while riding. If a twig hit it and made a dent, he would take it off and smooth it out. I think General Grant was a little proud of his riding. He would gallop off to meet some officer and dashing up would suddenly rein his horse and dismount before the horse had stopped. I love that little description of Grant. And one of the most notable occasions, I think, for Ely Parker during the Civil War was the moment when it is quite likely he saved Grant from either being killed or captured by the Confederate forces. It was May 4th. Grant had just crossed the Rapidan River. The Battle of the Wilderness that followed was about to occur. It was a desperate struggle. The woods and the brush caught fire. Soldiers on both sides were losing their way. The night had fallen, and General Grant and General George Gordon Meade, who had defeated Lee at Gettysburg, they were on their way to their headquarters at a place called Todd's Tavern. The smoke from the burning woods was everywhere. It was very hard to see anything, and the road ahead of them was clogged with wagons. Colonel Cyrus Comstock, who was Grant's aide-de-camp, suggested they should try another road that was open off to their right. Riding close behind them, Ely Parker sensed immediately that something was wrong. The years he spent in Canada at Grand River had never left him. Even in an unfamiliar setting, he could find his way through the woodlands, and it was that way that night in the wilderness. As he himself put it years later, and this is a quote, I developed the instinct to feel the presence of game or danger. Perhaps I had the goodwill of the spirits. On that day, Parker sensed the direction they were heading would lead them into danger. He called ahead to Rawlins, who was one of Grant's members of his staff and a very close friend of Parker himself. He called ahead to Rawlins, if you keep going, you're going to be in the rebel lines. Rawlins heard those words and immediately called out to Grant, hey, General. By the way, Rawlins was like that. He was, hey, General. He just was sort of the kind of person who didn't stand much on the ceremony. Do you know where you are? Grant stopped his horse, looked around. No, he said. He looked to the man leading him. Comstock, do you know where you are? Comstock looked around and said, no. Ely and Rawlins had by now ridden up to the sign of General Grant, and Rawlins said, Parker here, he says if you don't look out, we'll ride plumb into the rebel lines. Grant understood how well Parker was versed in the way of the wilderness. And he turned to him and said, Parker, do you know where we are? Yes, General, Ely replied. Then, as Ely put it, this is a quote, Grant then quickly said, well then lead. I put spurs to my black horse and galloped off in another direction, and they rode full tilt behind me. Now that's an interesting story. But what makes that story even more interesting is a later development. And this again is from his unpublished autobiography. After the battle, I met a rebel captain we had captured, and he said to me, Colonel, I wish to ask you about a certain incident. The other day, I saw General Grant with General Meade and a party of which you were one riding into our lines. My men wanted to fire on you, but I said, hold on. They will ride in and we can capture the whole lot. Then I saw you ride up and say something to Grant, and your whole party galloped off in haste. You were within 40 rods of us, and we hope to get you in the next 5 minutes. Now, in addition to serving as Grant's secretary and sometimes as watchdog, in fact, After the assassination of Lincoln, Parker would not leave the front of Grant's tent. Every night he set himself up without sleeping in front of that tent for fear an assassin would come after Grant. He was a very loyal person to Grant. He often found himself engaged in engineering. He would help set up breastworks, artillery, making sure things were properly built because of his engineering skill. This is a description from J.T. Lockwood, who served with the 4th New York Heavy Artillery. And this is May 4th at Mechanicsville near Richmond. They just asked the women of a nearby house, the Shelton House, one of those large southern homes, to leave because the Union artillery was setting up nearby. The house might come under fire. The women haughtily refused to do so. "We shall not leave this house, for my husband is in command of the troops over there, and there is no danger of this house being fired upon." Colonel Parker heard those words. He then said politely, "Stay as long as you please, ladies. We shall not harm you." Then turning his officers, he said, "Throw up a redoubt directly in back of this house and plant a battery there." It was a clever bit of strategy, for that battery did unmerciful work, and it was a long time before the rebels even sent a single shell in our direction. One of the stories that is told about Parker and Grant has always been one of my favorites. There was a man who was from Galena, Illinois, who claimed that he knew General Grant real well. And he wanted to say hello to him. He wanted to greet him. And they said, "Well, he's there in his tent." And he went to the door of the tent and looked in. Grant was not in his tent, but there was Ely Parker sitting at Grant's desk and writing out one of Grant's orders. Well, the man looked, smiled, nodded, turned back and said, "Yep, that's him all right, though he's got all fired sunburns since I last seen him." I wanted to share again one last little bit, which I think is important about Parker and about the state that we're in today. You see, one of the things that Ely Parker ended up being was, in fact, a member of the group of people who were trying to deal with Reconstruction. In fact, one of the reasons that at one point after the Civil War, Ely Parker lost a great deal of his money and was almost impoverished is because he invested heavily in something called the Freedmen's Bank. This was an organization meant to provide financial stability for former slaves, and Ely Parker was very active in this organization. Unfortunately, through incredible corruption on the part of white governors of the bank, who stole literally the money and impoverished the people who had been part of it, the bank failed. It was never, ever addressed. This was something that happened, and Ely Parker himself was a person who had invested in that bank and thus suffered the consequences. There are so many stories that could be told about Ely Parker and about his life, and One Real American is a very thorough biography written for middle grade readers and on up. But one of the interesting things that I find about Parker is that his ability to go against the grain. He was a man of great determination. And he fell in love, as a matter of fact, with a young woman who was a white woman. And they became engaged. And the day they were to be married, and General Grant was going to be there at the wedding, he did not show up. He did not show up. He said later, the rumors went around Washington, D.C., that what had happened was that he had become drunk and that he had wandered off, and that as a result he never showed up for the wedding. But what he said himself had happened was rather interesting. He said that he was drugged, in fact, by another Iroquois Indian who invited him to have a drink of wine with him, and he woke up a day later after the wedding. This is a picture of Millie Orton Sackett, who was regarded as one of the belles of Washington, D.C. And what happened is she forgave him, and they set another date for the wedding. But when people came to that wedding, there was no one there at the church. And the reason was they had gotten married secretly the night before, with General Grant giving away the bride, because the rumor was out that they were going to assassinate Ely Parker, to prevent him from marrying a white woman, which indeed very likely was the case. Millie was asked years later if she married him because he was an Indian, and his reply was, "No, I married the general because I loved him." Theirs was a very successful and happy marriage until his passing away. They had a daughter together, and in his later years, Ely Parker, after the Civil War, became in charge of what was then the Bureau of Indian Affairs now. And he very successfully ran what was called Grant's peace policy. In fact, he had put forward to Grant the idea that rather than war, we should make peace with the different native nations. It would be financially and it would be socially a good thing to do. It would be good for our society. And so a policy throughout Grant's administration called the peace policy was followed, and Parker was the leading creator of that policy. However, there was still a problem with supplying to the native people in the reservations in the West. And I'll just try to describe this really quickly. It was like the iron triangle we have between contractors today, which produces a $1,000 hammer being sold to the military. In those days, contractors were hired to provide beef, to provide cattle for the reservations. As part of the treaties, they had agreed they would feed them, and therefore they would agree not to make war. They would agree to cessions of certain parts of their land. But what occurred was these corrupt contractors would work with the Indian agents, equally corrupt. They would drive a herd of cattle to a reservation. They would collect the money, then would drive the herd of cattle to the next reservation, collect the money, and leave nothing for anyone to eat. So at one point, it looked as if the Lakotas were going to rebel again. And the Lakota Rebellion, as it was called, which was just basically protecting their own land, had led to the abandonment of a number of forts during what was called Red Cloud's War. The period of the Civil War saw the Lakota people in great unrest. And it looked as if another war was going to start, so Parker, on his own, decided to buy the food necessary to keep them from going to war. And he was charged with corruption for not having gone through the proper channels. He had enemies in the Indian office who did not like seeing an Indian in charge of things, and he was put to trial. He was found not guilty, but he resigned because he felt that having been put to trial, he would be an impediment to General Grant. So he left the service of the United States at that point. He then went on to live in Connecticut. He earned a fortune on Wall Street, but because of the Freedmen's Bank, he lost that fortune. Then he was invested in various securities, and there was one of those Wall Street crashes, and then he lost all his money 3 different times. On one occasion, he'd agreed to be the guarantor for a white man who proceeded to embezzle money and leave the country. And Parker was told, as an Indian, he was not responsible. He did not have to pay back the creditors. But he said, I am a man first, before that. And he paid back the creditors and again impoverished himself. In his final years, Parker worked as a clerk for the New York State Police Department, the most famous clerk the New York State Police Department ever had. He was working, as a matter of fact, for one of Grant's sons, who was then in charge of the police department. And one of the people he knew at that time was a young man named Theodore Roosevelt, who was proud of his association with Ely Parker. In his last years, he suffered a number of illnesses, a number of strokes, and finally, when he passed away, he was buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo. I didn't mention the prophecy of his mother. When he was, just before he was born, his mother had a dream. And in that dream, she saw that her son would be born. In fact, she went to a man called a dream speaker. Among the Haudenosaunee, dreams are regarded as having great power. Sometimes they're prophetic. Sometimes they express a wish of the heart, very Freudian, as a matter of fact. And the dream speaker interpreted her dream. In her dream, she had seen what looked like a city, what looked like a rainbow, with different figures on that rainbow and writing that looked like European writing, and the rainbow was broken in the middle. The dream speaker said, "This means that your son will be a great man among both the white and the European world. He will be
a great man to his people and a great man to the Indians. But his path will be broken halfway through. But he will return to the land of his people in death. Parker himself always poo-pooed that dream. He said, oh, that dream of my mother's. Don't pay any attention to it. But in fact, he was buried below the grave of Red Jacket on what had been part of the Buffalo Creek Reservation before the city of Buffalo was built. I find him to be a person of great inspiration for a number of reasons. I think the very fact that he encountered difficulty again and again in his life and pushed forward through that difficulty is an important lesson. I think the fact that he showed a person could be born in one world but survive in another, that those different makeups we have of European culture, of Native American culture, that they can be navigated between. And basically, more than anything else, his common and decent humanity, to me, is a great guiding light. And I am honored to have been able to write this book, One Real American, that tells his story for young readers to hear. Parker regarded Grant as a great friend throughout his life. He was a great defender of Grant. He would constantly speak on his behalf. Whenever he gave a lecture and people criticized Grant, he would not allow that. He was friends with Grant's family. He was at Grant's burial. He was one of the pallbearers at Grant's burial. So he did not completely separate from Grant. He did say, though, that what happened is that Grant's wife was so interested in filthy lucre, as he put it, that it blinded Grant to what was going on during his administration, and that it led Grant away from the people who cared for him most. In fact, what was most distressing to Parker was that when Rawlins, who was a good friend of the general's and of Grant's, was dying, he kept calling for General Grant, and General Grant never came to his bedside. Parker was there, but Grant was not. So, although they were never as close as they had been during Grant's administration and, of course, during the Civil War, there was not a feeling that there was a total break between them, but rather that Parker had gone his own way, had taken his own path, and that as a veteran, and as a very prominent veteran, a very much called upon speaker, he was frequently in his speeches defending Grant and talking about Grant's legacy. So there was a lot of criticism of Grant after the Civil War, as you all know, but Parker never spoke badly of him. And I think that Grant appreciated that in Parker, although they did not pal around together. I think there was still a distant feeling of friendship between the two of them. Original signing, original writing out of the terms of surrender was not supposed to be done by Ely Parker. It was supposed to be done by someone else. Bowers, in fact, was the one who was supposed to do it. The Manifold book was given to Bowers for him to make an official copy. He tried to do so, but his hands were shaking so much he destroyed one sheet after another. Finally, he gave up the task. Parker, he said, "You'll have to write this. I can't do it." And Parker was, thus, the terms of surrender were written in the hand of Ely S. Parker, and the calmest man at Appomattox. And it was said that one thing that characterized Parker all the time he was in the Civil War was tremendous calm. In fact, at one point when he was riding along, a rebel battery about maybe 50 yards or 100 yards away fired a cannon at him. And he watched the cannonball coming towards him, then leaned to the side, and it just went past him, flicked his coat as it went by. He wrote about that later. He also wrote about how imperturbable Grant was, how Grant let nothing bother him. He just ride into the face of danger with bullets flying all around him. And Parker said, on numerous occasions, I found myself with holes in my own jacket from riding close to General Grant during the Civil War. Well, I think that because Ely Parker spent his last years so primarily divorced from his native people, he didn't have a close relationship with the reservation, as did his siblings. although he did occasionally go back there. On one occasion, a young woman who was a little girl, when she saw him, thought he was a white man who visited the reservation. She didn't know who he was. And he hasn't been as celebrated by the Seneca Nation as I think he might be. I think that you'll find that when someone makes a decision Parker made to live a life as a European, it's controversial. It was. Also, I have to say that this happens often in small communities. He was criticized by his own people. After all the work he did, people said, well, he's setting himself up as better than we are. Or he's enriched himself, which was untrue. He never earned a penny for anything he did for the Seneca Nation, but rumors were made. His brother was often writing him saying they're saying terrible things. And then they say, oh, but they want you again. They're saying this, oh, but now they need you. So he went back and forth. And I think there was a little bit of bitterness on his part, the way he was treated. Even though he was a sachem, he was a leader, he was often criticized. But then again, there's a famous saying among the Iroquois, famous certainly among the Iroquois people, that is that if you would be a chief or a leader, your skin must be 7 thumbs thick. 7 thumbs thick. And there was a painting that was done, an illustration that was done by Jesse Cornplanter, who was an Iroquois, Seneca Iroquois artist. And it shows a chief walking along, and then there are bushes all around him, and people are shooting arrows at him from the bushes, and the arrows are bouncing off his body as he continues to walk along. So there is that too. He'd spent so many years away from the reservation as an engineer, working in Virginia on the Albemarle Canal, for example, working in Galena, Illinois, and then going to the Civil War, that his time on the reservation was relatively small. But because he followed that way of the Europeans so much so in his final years, I think that a lot of people may have discounted him somewhat. I've heard some people say that they felt he was a traitor to his people because he didn't stay with them. And yet it was because of Parker, in large part, that the reservation exists to this day. And contemporary Seneca leaders I know have great respect for Ely Parker. And I think that his legacy will be appreciated even more in the future by the Haudenosaunee people. And Major Pratt, later General Pratt, had the idea that rather than killing Indians, we will kill their culture. So it was assimilation from that point on. From the 1880s on, Native young people were sent to boarding schools, and the work was to try to destroy the language, the culture, and everything that was Native, and turn them into useful second-class American citizens, although they still did not have the right to vote. Right to vote and citizenship was not given or allowed to Native people until well into the early part of the 20th century, like the 3rd or 4th decade. That's when it finally happened. So that idea of destroying Native culture, of assimilating, was indeed even more powerful after Ely Parker. And Parker was sometimes used as an example. See what you can become. You can advance as he did if you simply give up your savage ways and immerse yourself, as Pratt put it, we immerse themselves, we hold them under in our culture until their Indian ways drown. A very sort of a forceful and violent image of what to do to Native people. And I think that we find that in the 20th century, a lot of what's happened in the 20th century, especially from the mid-century on, has been a reclaiming of Native culture, of Native history, of Native rights. The Native American Freedom of Religion Act was not passed until late in the 20th century. Till late in the 20th century, Native people could not practice their own religion without breaking the law. So this idea of assimilation or acculturation or basically extermination still existed, but in the forms of education, forced education. And the stories that people will tell you of Indian schools, many of my own friends, I never went to an Indian school, I was fortunate, but many people I grew up with later on, I found out they had been to Indian schools and their lives had been deeply impacted. Those Indian schools lasted until the latter 2 decades of the 20th century. So it's an interesting sort of kind of cultural dead end that was created in the American Indian boarding schools, and in Canada as well. There they had what were called residential schools. And in the 1870s and the 1880s, those last years of his life, what opportunities were there on the Seneca Reservation? What could you do on Tonawanda? There were no jobs. There was no industry. There was very little opportunity. To succeed, you had to leave the reservation. That's still true in many cases today, that reservations have been so impoverished, so turned into dead ends, that there's no opportunity outside, unless you go outside them. For example, at present, with the COVID-19 outbreak, one of the parts of the country being most devastatingly impacted is the Navajo Reservation. Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado. It's a gigantic reservation. It has over 180,000 Navajo people live spread out across that reservation, often in very distant single house units, often elderly people, often infirm people, and the death rate and the COVID rate is very high. There are a whole group of different organizations. I've been contributing to a bunch of them to provide relief, Native American relief organizations. And the Navajo Nation itself has a website where you can donate to help support those people on those reservation communities. But most of my good friends who are educated Navajo people end up working, at least for part of their lives, off the reservation. They may get a job in a university, they may do something else, and come back to the reservation, but not spend their entire time there, because the opportunities are still so limited in these distant communities. And it's understandable that Parker himself, as a man of education, as a man with a family, wanted to support his family and himself,